fall asleep to entire history of the Mayan civilization. Ancient history. Documentary. They did not call themselves Maya. That was a name whispered much later, written in books they never read. In the beginning, they were simply people. People of the corn. People of the river. People who spoke to the sky and listened for answers in the silence of trees. Their homes were small and woven, but their thoughts were wide. They built no palaces yet, no pyramids, only shelters and gardens, cradled by the forest that was never still. The air was heavy with birdsong, with insects humming in rhythm with the breath of the land. Time did not rush. It unfolded like leaves in morning light. Their hands shaped clay, and their eyes traced the patterns in the stars. No kings, no borders. Just families that moved when the rains changed, who followed the rhythm of the sun, who knelt to thank the earth for giving. It was in this stillness, in this waiting place between worlds, that a great story began. You are part of that story now. And before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. We truly love and care for you. This is your space to rest. Let the night settle around you like a warm cloth. Let history become something soft enough to sleep inside. Long before the great stone cities rose from the jungle floor, the land was already sacred. Trees grew tall like cathedral walls. Roots gripped the underworld. Branches touched the heavens. Between them, people lived close to the soil. They planted maize and carried it like an offering. Each kernel was a story, each field a memory. They sang to their crops. They prayed to the wind. Everything was alive. The hills had faces. The caves had voices. Water moved like a quiet god. No one ruled over anyone. But knowledge moved like a thread from village to village. Someone knew where the water ran clean. Another knew when the deer would pass through. Another remembered which stars meant that the rains were near. They shared what they knew without coin, without force. This was not paradise, but it was balance. A woven net of old ways, of old paths, shaped not by conquest but by care. Slowly, some voices became louder than others, some hands more skilled, some stories heavier with meaning. Around them, others gathered, and power, like a seed, began to grow. They did not have writing yet, but they remembered. Memory lived in chants, in ashes, in the way a mother touched her child's hair while telling the old tales. When a child died, they believed the soul returned in another face, another name. Time was not straight. It curled and folded like smoke. One day would come again. One king could return. They believed this deeply. They built their lives around it. They marked the passing of days with carvings on bark and bone. When a comet passed, they watched with silence. When the moon hid her face, they waited. Patterns meant everything. Nothing happened by chance. To live without knowing the meaning behind the weather, the stars, the harvest, that was to be lost. So they learned, and they remembered. And their memory, passed hand to hand, became the quiet seed of civilization. Not yet cities, not yet conquest. Just the long preparation, like breath before speech, like silence before a storm. In the lowlands, where the jungle pressed close and the heat curled in the air, small communities grew into larger ones. Swamps were drained, hills were flattened. Fields became more than just food. They were signs of order. They began to measure time not only in seasons, but in cycles, in turns of the sun and shadow. They began to count days, to name them. Each day held its own weight, its own spirit. Births were chosen carefully, marriages arranged by the calendar. Everything had a right moment. And those who knew the moments, the keepers of time, were respected like sages. They became the first elites, not warriors, but watchers. They carved memory into stone. They wore feathers like crowns. Slowly the first temples rose, Not large, not loud, but lifted above the plain. A place to meet the gods, to speak with the dead. The jungle watched. The gods listened. And the people looked inward, upward, outward, all at once. Among them, a child was born who looked at the stars longer than he looked at his own hands. He sat beneath trees and counted the moons. He watched the ants move in lines and thought of armies. He saw the lines between the stars and drew them into pictures on the ground. His name is forgotten, but what he saw changed everything. It is said he built no temple, won no battle, but his thoughts became the thoughts of others. He showed them that time was a wheel, not a river, that destiny moved in loops, not lines, that nothing was truly gone. This idea sank into their bones. It shaped their gods, their calendars, their cities. They began to think like him. And when others rose, kings, warriors, priests, they carried that vision inside them. Time as a story that repeats. Life as something eternal. Death as a bend in the path. That is when the stone began to speak. That is when memory became architecture. And the first chapter of Maya history quietly ended. Not with war, but with a whisper, a breath, a pause before the rising thunder. There were no kings at first, only elders. Men and women who remembered the winds and the shape of rivers. But memory was fragile. It faded with drought. It faltered with hunger. As villages grew, stories alone could not hold them together. People began to look toward those who built more than others. Those who hunted better. Those who knew the names of stars and when to plant beneath them. And in time, those people gathered others around them. Not to rule, not yet, but to guide. With time, that guidance grew heavier. Guidance became law. Voices became commands. And small hills were shaped into places of power. That was how the first leaders rose. Not by war, but by weight. The weight of responsibility. The weight of being watched. They became symbols as much as people. They wore jade around their necks, heavy as silence. They fasted before the harvest. They wept in front of altars. And the people watched, hoping that the gods saw them too. In those early years, the Maya lowlands were a world of many small lights. Villages scattered like stars, not yet connected by roads or rivalry. But seeds of division had already been planted. Inheritance began. Land began to mean more than survival. It became power. And power, once tasted, never forgets its hunger. Corn was everything. It was life, body, and spirit. They believed their ancestors had been shaped from maize dough, given breath by the gods. So when the corn failed, it was not just hunger. It was fear. It was a feeling that something had gone wrong between them and the sky. The earliest temples were built not for glory, but for balance, to keep the world turning. Priests were not yet distant. They walked among the farmers. They touched the same earth, spoke the same prayers. But slowly, they began to rise above. They spoke in longer words. They wore feathers the common people could not touch. They began to live near the temples, where the ground was higher and the air a little cleaner. Corn still grew, but it grew in rows beside stone, and stone made things permanent. What once was a hut became a shrine. What once was a man became a god's voice, and slowly that voice forgot how to whisper. It began to echo. In time, rulers and priests became partners in power. One gave signs, the other gave orders. They both lived above the rest. Below them, the farmers planted, prayed, and watched the sky, hoping the rains would come, hoping the gods still listened. In the cracks of that hope, something old began to shift. Something no one could name yet. The forest was always listening. It swallowed paths quickly, but it remembered footsteps. Between the lowlands and the highlands, more villages were born. These were farther from the first temples, farther from the old priests, and in those places, the people found new rhythms, They learned how to shape water, how to store it. They learned how to trade salt, jade, feathers, honey. Goods moved across long distances, carried on backs, through vines and over rivers. Along with them moved news and stories and rumors of rulers who spoke with the gods, of cities rising in the jungle, of wars in the making. It was not war yet, but tension moved like smoke, unseen but always present. Villages that once shared rituals now began to mark their gods in different ways. Carvings grew more complex, masks more exaggerated. Each community slowly shaped its own identity, its own truth, and truth, once claimed, must be defended. That is how borders began, not with walls, but with stories, lines drawn in belief, in ancestry, in pride. One city might say its king was born from the sun, another from the moon, another still from the corn itself. These were not just myths, they were declarations. Declarations that said, "We are not you." And that small sentence, "We are not you," became the root of the first quiet conflicts. In the southern lowlands, time moved faster. The villages near the Petin forests grew denser. Fields expanded. Droughts came and went, and each cycle left deeper marks. The land was rich, but not endless. The gods were patient, but not blind. When crops failed, rulers asked for more prayers, more blood, more obedience, but the rains still stayed away, and the people began to look not at the gods, but at their kings. Suspicion bloomed in silence. They could not speak openly, but they watched more closely. Priests began to speak of purity, of sacrifice, of pleasing the gods through pain. The temples grew taller, the people grew smaller, and yet none of this erupted. Not yet. This was a time of pressure, not explosion, of slow shifts. The kings gave more ceremonies, the priests gave more answers, and the people gave more of themselves. It was not rebellion. It was not yet betrayal, but the threads of unity began to fray, and in the heart of the jungle, the first great city began to rise. Tikal. Not yet powerful, not yet feared, but already watching, already measuring. It rose on raised platforms, high enough to see the horizon. And from that height, its leaders looked out. They did not see trees, they saw neighbors, rivals, opportunities. The jungle, once a place of worship, became a place of strategy. The gods did not leave, but they shared the stage now, with men who had begun to dream not only of survival, but of dominion. It began quietly, not with fire, not with armies, but with glances across the forest paths and altars built a little too close to someone else's fields. Cities had names now, not just places to grow corn, but centers of meaning. Tikal, Kalakmul, El Mirador, Ouacaktun. They stood among the trees like watchful giants, not yet covered in glory, but no longer small. They had kings now, or something like kings. Holy lords, keepers of days. Their faces were carved into stone. Their names were sung by priests. Their feet never touched mud. They dressed in jaguar pelts and feathered cloaks. They spoke in riddles and signs. But even behind the mystery, they were human. They were hungry. Not for food, but for legacy. In the jungle, land was power. Corn was power. Rain was power. And people were power too. Especially when they bowed to you. Especially when they gave their daughters in marriage and built temples in your name. The Maya world was still young, but it was beginning to change shape. It no longer turned in place. It began to move forward, slowly and unevenly, towards something harder, sharper, less forgiving. That slow drift toward war would leave no village untouched. Where two cities met, they watched one another, not just with traders and gossip, but with spies and scribes. Who was building what? Who was carving whose name in stone? Who was marrying whom? A child born in a royal house could shape a whole alliance. A gift of jade could end a conflict before it began, but not every slight could be covered. Not every ambition could be hidden. Tensions built not like storms, but like droughts, slowly, quietly, until the ground cracked. That's how the first skirmishes began, not great battles, not epic wars, but raids, ambushes, a noble taken on the road, a shrine burned in the night. No one declared war. No one needed to. Cities had grown proud, and pride does not share easily. Each one believed their gods chose them. Each one traced their lineage back to the sky. The temples that had once risen in praise began to compete for height. A city that carved a calendar on stone saw its rival carve too. Kings who once exchanged greetings now exchanged warnings. It was not hate that drove them. It was belief. A belief that their world must be the center, that their rule must last. And when belief sharpens, it cuts. In the darkness of the forest, warriors painted their faces black and red. They wore bones and jaguar teeth. They carried obsidian blades, sharper than metal, light as silence. They moved in small groups, hidden by trees, guided by stars. These were not armies, not yet. These were messages sent by kings, not words, but blood. Capture was the aim, not killing. To take a noble from a rival city, to display him in chains, to cut his heart on your own altar, that was power. It said the gods were with you. It said the stars favored your city. So the cities began to circle one another, not openly, but with careful steps. Alliances were tested. Marriages arranged across distances. A son of Tikal might wed a daughter of Karakol. But if that bond frayed, if the dowry insulted, if the child died, the peace it had bought vanished. Conflict in the Maya world was often slow, but it was never still. Even when there was no fighting, there was watching. Even when there was no blood, there was preparation. Kings prayed louder, priests demanded more, people knelt longer. The gods, it seemed, were listening. But they had grown harder to please. Temples became taller, their steps steeper, their altars darker. Sacrifice increased. Not just animals now, but people. Captured nobles, captured kings. Their names were recorded, sometimes even their faces, carved into stone as a proof of power. The Maya did not destroy their enemies silently. They displayed them. They made memory into weaponry. A fallen lord might live forever, but only in the pose of defeat. This was how history turned into theatre. Cities carved their victories onto stelae, tall stone monuments placed in the open where everyone could see. They did not just want to win, they wanted others to remember who had lost. Still, the battles remained small. Precision strikes, elite warriors, single, days of violence followed by weeks of ritual. But something was changing. The scale was growing. Cities like Tikal and Calakmul were no longer just defending borders. They were building networks, vassal towns, tribute routes. Their kings claimed not only divine descent, but universal right. This was no longer a world of equals. The Maya world, once a constellation of small stars, was beginning to form galaxies, centers of gravity. And wherever there is gravity, there is tension. And eventually there is fire. The first flames of real war began not when a city fell, but when an idea took hold. That one ruler, one dynasty, one city could stand above all others. That the gods would bless such ambition. Tikal believed this, so did Calakmul. Each began to gather allies. Cities nearby were no longer neighbors. They were pieces on a board. Some joined willingly. Others were pulled by threat, by promise, or by marriage. Battles became larger, not constant, not total, but more frequent, more costly. Armies now marched in daylight, drums echoing through the canopy. Fields were trampled, villages fled. Temples were looted not for wealth, but for meaning. To steal a god statue was to steal the heart of a city. Each war had a ritual start. Each victory had a ceremonial end. The captured were paraded. The dead were buried with honor or shame. But even in all this, the Maya still held their world together with story. War was not chaos. It was theater, sacred, structured, and yet, beneath the ritual, real pain grew. Real hunger, real fear. A mother watching her son leave for battle. A child waiting for a father who would never return. The Maya world had changed. And once changed, it could not go back. The fires had started. Quietly, symbolically, but truly. And they would not go out for centuries. Tikal did not rise in a single day. It did not roar into being with banners and conquest. It grew like a tree in the forest, slowly, patiently, with roots that pushed deeper before branches reached outward. At first, it was only another city among many, its pyramids no taller, its lords no louder. But it was in the center of things. Rivers met there, trade paths passed through it, priests arrived with gifts, scribes stayed to copy calendars. The kings of Tikal began to see themselves not only as rulers, but as chosen. Their name meant place of whispers, a quiet power, watching everything. They built carefully. A new temple here, a new palace there, each carved with glyphs that remembered. They did not erase the past. They absorbed it. They honored old gods and made them their own. As other cities fought, Tikal prepared. They sent daughters to marry distant kings. They offered peace, then trade, then terms. And those who accepted found their temples filled with wealth. Those who did not began to vanish from the records. Not through burning, through silence. Tikal was learning a new kind of war. A war not only of blades and blood, but of influence. The march of power had begun, and it moved slowly, like shadow creeping across stone. In the south, Copan rose in a different way. It was farther from the center, closer to the mountains. Its kings were artists, scholars, architects. Their stelae were taller, their carvings finer. They believed beauty was power, and that the gods lived in proportion and balance. But beauty too can be a weapon. They built the hieroglyphic stairway, a massive stone staircase filled with over 2,000 glyphs, each one a piece of memory, a record of rule. It did not shout, it sang, and other cities listened. Copan did not challenge Tikal directly. Instead, it cultivated respect. It hosted gatherings, shared rituals, played the long game of diplomacy. But behind the elegance, it too was preparing. Its rulers studied not just stars, but politics. They read the stones of other cities, watched alliances shift, counted the days until change would come. In this world, power was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it wore a mask of jade and smiled. Between these centers, smaller cities chose their sides. Caracol, Quirigua, Naranjo. They were not weak, only smaller in scale, but they had their own kings, their own gods, their own reasons. Some aligned with Tikal, seeing strength in empire. Others leaned toward Calakmul, Tikal's rising rival in the north. Calakmul's kings had begun to whisper their own claim to destiny. They too traced their blood to the heavens. They too raised temples into the sky. The Maya world was becoming a chessboard. Every alliance counted. Every marriage shaped the future. A single priest defecting from one court to another could shift the balance. A royal child born under the wrong constellation could break a treaty. These were not nameless people. Their faces still live in stone, in glyphs, in museums far from the jungle where they once ruled. They smiled as they were carved, unaware of what lay ahead, of how fragile their power was, of how many would fall. The wars returned. Not suddenly, not with fire, but with purpose. Tikal struck Calakmul through its allies. Calakmul answered the same way. Armies moved through jungle paths. Messengers were captured. Cities changed hands. Glyphs recorded victories in rigid joy. There was no pity carved into stone, only names, dates, symbols of defeat. But the people, the weavers, the farmers, the children, they carried the weight in silence. Power moved like a wind through their lives, tearing roofs, changing laws, erasing names, and yet they endured. The women still ground maize before dawn, the men still fished the rivers. Life continued beneath the wars. But above, the march of power deepened. Great kings emerged with titles longer than a breath. They were not merely rulers. They were divine intermediaries, speaking for the gods. When they walked, trumpets sounded. When they bathed, the water was blessed. Their feet did not touch the same ground as their people. They became myth while still alive. And yet, they too were fragile. Their power depended on belief, on the trust of priests, on the fear of rivals, on the blessings of weather. If the corn failed, if the stars misaligned, if a battle was lost, their divinity could vanish overnight. And once it vanished, it was hard to find again. This was the golden age of Maya kingship. Not peace, not happiness, but structure. A world ordered by calendars, by lineage, by the illusion of permanence. The plazas filled with dancers. The temples filled with incense. Every full moon brought new ceremonies. Every eclipse brought new fear. Kings consulted the sky before war, before marriage, before death. Time was their weapon and their prison. They ruled by prophecy. They lived in the shadow of old stories. But they believed. They believed deeply. And that belief built cities. The temples of this age still stand. At Tikal, at Copan, at Calakmul. You can stand on their steps, feel the worn stone beneath your hand, and know that people once knelt here. That someone once looked up from that plaza and saw a king, a god, a dream. That someone once wept here. Not from fear, from awe. The march of power had built something lasting, but nothing, not even carved stone, lives forever. And beneath the surface of this grandeur, the fault lines were forming. The alliances were growing thin. The corn would fail again. The skies would darken again. And the kings, for all their power, would learn that stone can break, that stories can be forgotten, that power, once grasped, begins to slip through the fingers, grain by grain. The world shifted quietly at first, like the slow bending of a great tree in a storm. The cities that once stood like distant stars now burned brighter and hotter. The rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul had turned into a war that stretched across the jungle like wildfire. Neither side sought peace, only advantage. Alliances were fragile threads, breaking and reforming as quickly as the wind changed direction. Armies marched beneath canopies heavy with humidity, where sunlight barely touched the ground. Warriors, painted in black and red, moved silently like shadows. The drums beat a steady rhythm, calling not only the living but echoing the cries of those who had fallen before. This was a world where power was measured in blood, where the gods demanded sacrifice not only of animals, but of humans. Captives were taken in battle, paraded through plazas before being offered to the gods in ceremonies soaked in fire and fear. The air was thick with smoke, with incense, with the heavy scent of sweat and earth. The jungle, once a place of worship and wonder, had become a witness to destruction. But even as cities burned, life pressed stubbornly on beneath the ashes. The war was not only fought with weapons, but with words and symbols. Kings carved their victories on stone, their faces frozen in triumph. But behind the grandeur lay the quiet suffering of many. The farmers whose fields were trampled by marching feet. The women who waited in silence, holding children close while their husbands marched away. The old who prayed for the rains that might not come. Cities lost their luster as blood stained their steps. Some were abandoned, swallowed slowly by the jungle's relentless growth. Others stood defiant but hollow, their temples empty except for the echoes of past glory. The gods, it seemed, were no longer kind. The rains became scarce. The rivers shrank. Hunger gnawed at the edges of every city. The kings still claimed divine favor, but the people whispered doubts in the dark. What price would they pay for the god's silence? What stories would survive the flames? Amidst the destruction, some cities rose briefly like phoenixes from the ashes. They seized moments of weakness, carved new alliances, or betrayed old friends. The political landscape was a shifting maze of promises and betrayals. The balance of power never stayed still for long. The wars stretched across generations, shaping not only borders but the very spirit of the Maya world. Each battle left scars deeper than wounds. Each treaty signed was fragile, held together by fear and hope in equal measure. The landscape of power was cracked, but not yet broken. Cities still built temples, still carved calendars, still danced in the plazas beneath the watchful eyes of the gods. But the cost of war was etched into every stone, every glyph, every whispered prayer. It was a cost that would grow heavier with time, until the foundation itself began to crumble. And beneath it all, the fireflies fled. Small lights disappearing into the night. Children born into uncertainty. Elders who had seen better days. Farmers who no longer trusted the rain. The stories told in hushed tones around the fire spoke of a world changing too fast. The old gods were silent or angry. The kings were distant or dead. The cities were full of ghosts, and the jungle waited patiently to reclaim them. The Maya world was a tinderbox, and the flames had spread beyond control. But even as the fire raged, the people who lived through it did not stop believing. They held onto memory, to song, to the idea that the world could heal. The jungle would grow again. The rains would return. The corn would rise from the dust. This was a world on fire, yes, but it was also a world waiting for dawn. The war did not rage only beyond city walls. It seeped into homes, into hearths where quiet lives were lived. Women sat weaving beneath the heavy shade of ceiba trees, their fingers tracing patterns older than memory. The cloth they made told stories of joy, of loss, of waiting. Widows gathered in silence, sharing the weight of absence. Their husbands had marched away with promises of glory, with prayers to the gods, with hopes for peace. But peace was a stranger. The sons who had been boys were now men hardened by fighting, or they never returned at all. The fields that fed families lay fallow, or trampled, and hunger whispered in empty kitchens. Mothers held their children close against nights filled with uncertainty. The lullabies became prayers for protection, for the return of fathers, for the coming of rain. The war was a shadow that stretched over every home, a silent thief stealing time, stealing dreams. Even as temples rose and kings donned crowns, the people suffered quietly, unseen beneath the grandeur. Within palaces, the air grew heavy with expectation and fear. The rulers who had once been men among men now lived encased in silence. Their power was measured not only by armies, but by the fear they inspired in those closest to them. Behind ornate walls, decisions were made that shaped thousands of lives. Decisions made alone, burdened by the knowledge that one mistake could topple kingdoms. Yet even kings were human. They felt the loneliness of power, the cold weight of responsibility. Advisors whispered warnings. Priests demanded sacrifices. The threat of rebellion lingered like a storm on the horizon. The hunger outside the palace gates was felt inside as well. Feasts became less frequent. The songs sung in the great halls grew quieter. The child king, barely old enough to understand the meaning of crowns, looked out at a world burning quietly beyond the walls. He wept for the fathers lost, for the mothers left behind, for the future he could not yet grasp. The war was not only fought with weapons, it was fought in silence, in shadows, in hearts grown heavy with sorrow. Walls of corn and bones separated the rulers from the ruled, but the divide was more fragile than stone. Messages carried across cities spoke of rebellions quietly crushed, of villages refusing tribute, of priests who no longer believed their gods would protect them. The land itself seemed tired. The rains came late, or not at all. Hunger gnawed at the edges of loyalty. The people, though weary, held on. They planted what seeds they could, prayed at the altars that still stood, and gathered when festivals dared to bloom. But the peace of these moments was fragile, a brief breath in a long struggle. The war had become not only a clash of armies, but a fracture in the spirit of a people. Every stone carved with victory hid stories of defeat. Defeat felt in empty beds, in abandoned fields, in hearts that could no longer hope. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the jungle held its breath, the war's true cost could be heard. The child king, far from the roar of battle, knew loss in ways no crown could mend. He watched as the faces of his ancestors were carved into stone, forever young, forever strong. But he also saw the faces that were missing. Those who had died too young, those who had fallen in forgotten skirmishes, those whose names were erased by time. He felt the weight of history pressing down, a burden of memory and expectation. Yet in the stillness, there was also something else, a fragile hope. The hope that the war would end, that the gods would listen once more, that the land would heal, and that the children born into this shadowed world might one day know peace. The war at home was silent but unyielding. It shaped lives not with swords, but with absence, not with fire, but with tears. It was the quiet song beneath the thunder of battle. The altars stood still beneath the weight of passing time. The blood had dried. The warriors had gone. The drums no longer echoed through the trees. And in the hush that followed, the cities listened to their own emptiness. Birds returned cautiously to the temple tops. Vines crept closer to plazas where kings once spoke in thunder. The silence between battles was not peace. It was breath, a pause in the rhythm of struggle. In those days, the people turned inward, not to forget, but to endure. They swept the stone floors, mended the broken walls, lit fires in homes that had gone dark. Life, slow and wounded, pressed on. The Maya world had not fallen, but it had quieted. And in that quiet, something ancient stirred, not the gods, but memory. The people remembered the old days, before kings grew so distant, before war became calendar. They remembered the fields when they were whole, the sky when it was generous. They spoke softly to one another in kitchens, beside streams, beneath the wide green canopy. No one spoke of victory, only survival, only the simple joy of a meal shared, of rain on the roof, of a child's laughter returning like a bird in spring. There were no feasts in the great halls now. The royal courts held fewer ceremonies. The priests spoke less often. The stars still turned above, but their meanings seemed less certain. The scribes who once wrote of glory now recorded only the passing days. A time moved forward, but its weight was different. It no longer pressed the people toward greatness. It simply flowed like water, over stone, around roots. Dreams became quieter, less golden, more real. The young no longer grew up with stories of conquest. They listened to their mothers sing old songs, lullabies of wind and soil and survival. In the city of Copan, a scribe watched the plazas empty, and in that emptiness, he wrote not of kings, but of silence. He drew lines for the spaces between battles, for the women waiting, for the old men carving tools instead of weapons. He did not know if anyone would read what he wrote, but still, he wrote. Because even silence deserves memory. Even absence is part of history. Far away, other cities smoldered. Some never recovered, abandoned. Stone by stone as the jungle crept in. Roots cracked open doorways, birds nested in roof combs once lined with incense, but not all cities fell. Some lived in the quiet. They adapted. They grew smaller, more careful. They stopped reaching toward the stars and turned toward the earth. Families shared what they had. Communities built walls not to keep out armies, but to hold in warmth. Not every king vanished. Some ruled in gentler ways, not from fear, but from presence. They walked among their people. They listened. They led small rituals beside streams, not atop pyramids. These kings are less remembered, their names not carved in stone, but their people remembered them in stories. Stories passed mouth to mouth, heart to heart. This was a time of stillness, a time of planting, a time of repair. Between the fallen towers and the rising trees, the Maya remembered that not all power comes with force. Some comes with care, with patience, with listening. And in the distance, smoke rose from cities still unknown, cities yet to rise. The silence was not an ending, it was a turning, a breath before the next movement. The war had paused, but it had not ended. The ambitions of kings still smouldered beneath the surface. The stars still whispered prophecies to those who knew how to read. Children born in this time of quiet would grow into lords and priests and warriors. They would be told stories of a past that was golden or cruel, depending on the teller. And they would shape the next age with those stories in their hearts. But for now, the Maya world slept with one eye open. The jungle sang again. The temples echoed only the wind. And beneath it all, the people lived. Quietly. Strongly. The silence between battles was not emptiness. It was healing. It was memory growing roots. It was hope, too small to name but too stubborn to die. They said the stars still turned in the heavens, but their patterns no longer offered comfort. The old calendars still marked the days, still whispered the sacred intervals, but the meanings behind them had begun to unravel. The priests said the gods were testing them, that sacrifice would restore order, that tradition was the only path forward. But beneath the rituals and incense, something fragile had cracked. Cities once bound by lineage and belief now looked at each other with suspicion. Treaties signed in solemn silence were broken in the space between one harvest and the next. The Maya world, once a net of shared customs and sacred cycles, was fraying thread by thread. Caracol rose again in power, then fell. Quirigua stood briefly in rebellion, then quieted. Calakmul lost battles it never expected to lose. Even Tikal, with its long shadow and memory of glory, began to stumble. The turning point did not come with fire. It came with doubt, with hunger, with too many years of watching the sky for rain that did not come. Promises were made by kings who could no longer keep them. And the people, though still faithful, began to see the space between gods and men widening into silence. The broken promises were not always spoken aloud. Sometimes they lived in gestures, in a king who walked past his people without bowing, in a priest who demanded tribute from a village already starving, in a warrior who took from the poor what he had been given to defend. Slowly, the bonds that once held the cities together became brittle. Drought returned, not once, but again and again. The great reservoir dried, the rivers narrowed to threads, crops withered under a sky that no longer wept. The people did not curse the gods, but they began to wonder if the gods had turned their faces away. Sacrifices increased. Hearts were cut from captives with hands that trembled more than before. But the rains still did not come. Children were born into a world their parents no longer recognized. They grew up beside empty fields and crumbling walls. The pyramids were still there, but they no longer inspired awe. They stood like questions too large to answer. The past loomed heavy over the present, and the future blurred at the edges. Something had shifted, not in battle, but in belief. Cities that had once competed through temple heights and celestial calendars now began to measure power in survival. Smaller cities stopped sending tribute. Some stopped building altogether. Others turned inward, abandoning foreign alliances for local strength. The kings, once divine, became isolated. Surrounded by the courtiers and guarded walls, they spoke only to priests and scribes, not to the people. Their voices echoed through empty halls. They declared new rituals, new laws, new wars, but fewer listened. Some cities vanished almost without record. One year they were known, the next, only silence. Others were swallowed slowly, their steps worn smooth by wind and rain, their glyphs softened into mystery. It was not a collapse, not yet. It was a turning, a change in rhythm, the kind of change no one sees clearly while it happens. Only later do they call it the end of an age, but for those living through it, it was simply a question that never found an answer. How do you hold together a world when the story it is built on no longer speaks to the heart? And yet, the people did not vanish. They lived. They planted what they could. They sang the old songs to keep them alive. Some left their cities behind and walked into the forests, finding smaller places, gentler soil. Some stayed, clinging to memory, building new lives inside old ruins. A few kings still ruled, but with less certainty. A few temples still rose, but with fewer hands. The world did not burn. It dimmed. It quieted. But within that quiet was the soft beating of persistence. The Maya had always been a people of time, and now time was changing them. Not destroying, changing. In the end, the turning point was not marked by one war, one fall, one king's death. It was marked by the accumulation of sorrow and endurance, the breaking of promises that had once seemed eternal, the beginning of a story no longer carved in stone, but carried in the breath of those who remained. A story that would continue, even as the great cities fell asleep beneath the trees. The tide did not crash, it crept. Like mist curling at the edge of dawn, the change moved slowly across the Maya world, touching first the high cities and then the low valleys, sweeping through stone courtyards that still echoed with old chants. The great powers, once proud and loud, began to falter, not all at once, but in quiet succession. Tikal, that mighty pillar of kings and warriors, saw its influence thin like smoke. Calakmul, once its rival in the green depths, stumbled through years of weakened rulers and frayed alliances. The wars had not ended, but they had grown tired. Their rhythm changed. Less conquest, more confusion. The reasons behind the bloodshed began to blur. Cities attacked out of fear rather than vision. Dynasties ruled for shorter spans. Succession grew uncertain. The people still carved glyphs, but fewer could read them. Scribes still told stories, but fewer listened. The world was not ending, but the thread had loosened. The story no longer held together. And yet, as the tide turned, it did not bring only ruin, it brought change. And in change, there is always the chance for something new to grow. The forests grew thicker around forgotten cities. Roots pushed through staircases where nobles once climbed. Jaguars hunted silently in the plazas, and birds made nests in royal chambers. The jungle did not mourn. It welcomed the return of quiet. Nature had never belonged to kings, and now it remembered itself. The Maya people, scattered like seeds, began to take new shapes. Some left their ruined cities behind, moving eastward, settling closer to the coastlines and rivers. Others found new homes in the highlands, where the air was thinner and the gods seemed closer. In places like Uxmal and Chichen Itza, new centers rose. Not as grand as Tikal, not yet, but filled with a new kind of rhythm. Trade shifted. New routes emerged. The old power lines snapped and curled into unfamiliar patterns. Ceremonies changed. Masks changed. Stories changed. The gods were still present, but quieter, more distant. Or perhaps they had simply changed with the people, less demanding, more patient. The shift was not clean. It was uneven, uncertain, and full of grief. But it moved, slow as tide, sure as wind. In the city of Sable, once quiet and small, something unexpected stirred. A new dynasty rose. Foreign in origin, or perhaps local but once ignored, it offered a different voice. Not a return to glory, but a reimagining of it. The temples they built echoed older styles, but with softened lines. The rituals they held felt familiar, but they were different too. Shorter, more restrained. It was not revival. It was reinvention. And the people came. From nearby villages. From broken cities. They came not for conquest, but for community. The priests here spoke gently. The rulers did not call themselves divine. They listened. It was not a golden age, but it was a moment of light. One of several, scattered like small fires along the edges of a darkening world. In Chichen Itza, a new order rose, different in language, in law, in structure. No longer simply kings, but councils, shared rule, a collective voice, however fragile. They built great ball courts and broad platforms. There, buildings stood with unusual symmetry, and they lasted longer than most. Perhaps because they asked less of the people. Perhaps because they listened to the silence between each change. Still, the old centers could not return. No matter how carefully they were tended, no matter how many prayers were spoken, the soil had changed. The people had changed. The kings, once gods in flesh, were now only men. Tired, uncertain, mortal. Some still ruled with fire and ceremony, but more often they ruled by tradition, out of memory, out of habit. The world no longer moved around them. It moved beside them. And the people, the weavers, the farmers, the story keepers, they began to carry more of the burden. They taught their children to speak both the old tongue and the new. They carved what they could not write. They passed down stories in songs. The tide was still rising, still turning. It was not a fall. It was a fading, a soft erosion of the world that once was. But as the stones crumbled, the seeds beneath them stirred. And somewhere in the quiet hills or among the saber trees, a child looked at the stars, not with fear, but with wonder. The Maya world was not finished. It was becoming something else. It did not come all at once. There was no final battle, no trumpet sounding the end. Instead, it came in pieces, forgotten harvests, broken roads, a missing child, a well that dried too early. Each loss was small, but together they wore down the soul of a people. 1,000 small defeats, not carved in stone, but lived in silence. A king woke one morning to find his court thinner than it had been. A scribe sharpened his tools to record a war that never happened, because the soldiers never returned. A mother wept over a cold fire, knowing the gods had heard her prayers and chosen not to answer. Temples were not burned. They were left empty. Altars were not toppled. They simply gathered dust. The cities did not fall. They were outgrown by the trees. The Maya world, once built on precision and prophecy, began to feel the slow unraveling of belief. Not disbelief, just fatigue. The gods had asked too much. The kings had delivered too little. And the people, always the people, bore the weight between them. The rituals continued, but they felt thinner, shorter, quieter. Priests still climbed temple steps, still sang the old chants, but fewer people came to watch. They were tending to other things, to fields that needed clearing, to children that needed feeding. Some ceremonies continued not out of faith, but out of memory. To stop would feel like forgetting too much at once. So they carried on, even when the stars offered no reply. A carved stela might still appear in a plaza, but now its lines were shallower, its edges rough. There were fewer artists, fewer reasons. The great scribes of earlier centuries, those who wrote time itself into stone, had no apprentices. And so names faded. Genealogies ended. Cities once proud of their dynasties stopped recording them. It was not rebellion. It was not collapse. It was simply a loosening, like an old garment slipping off the shoulders. The Maya world was not broken. It was tired. And in that tiredness, the outlines of something else began to appear. Not a new civilization, but a simpler kind of life. One closer to the ground, to the rivers, to the day itself. Villages began to outlast their cities. Small communities, scattered along ridges and shores, became new centers of survival. They were not ruled by kings. They were led by elders, by storytellers, by those who knew the seasons best. Trade still moved, but in smaller circles. Ceremonies were held, but without palaces. Ball games were played, but not in stone courts, only in open fields with children chasing the echoes of old glory. The Maya had not vanished. They had transformed. Their strength had turned inward, not into conquest, but into endurance. They planted maize, not to feed armies, but to feed families. They watched the sky, not to guide wars, but to know when to sow and reap. They held onto language, to memory, to identity, not through monuments, but through mouths. A grandfather teaching his granddaughter the names of birds. A woman humming a song her mother sang when she was small. These were not victories, but they were not defeats either. They were life continuing, one small act at a time. Still, the pain of loss lingered. In every cracked stairway, in every glyph that no one could read, there was sorrow. Not dramatic sorrow, quiet sorrow. The kind that settles into bones and never quite leaves. The people lived with it, carried it. 1,000 small defeats, softened by time, but never erased. In some places, invaders had come, foreign ships, foreign voices, but they arrived into a world already weary. The Maya saw them not as the cause of their fall, but as another shape in the long story of survival. Some resisted, others retreated deeper into the forest, others stayed and adapted and waited. And through it all, the sky kept turning. The rains returned in some seasons. The corn rose again. The people remained. Not as kings, not as empire, but as families, as memory, as breath. What had been lost could not all be reclaimed. But what mattered most had not been taken. Not language, not spirit, not hope. The 1,000 small defeats had not been final. They had been reminders that even the strongest stones crumble, but roots hold. The last wars came not with fire, but with footsteps. They echoed down stone corridors once filled with song. The kings who remained summoned their warriors, not with trumpets, but with silence. Those who still ruled did so out of habit, out of memory, out of fear of what might come if they stopped. Cities like Chichen Itza, Mayapan, and Uxmal still rose against the sky, but their power no longer reached far. They had become islands, floating in the long tide of retreat. The Maya had grown tired of blood. But still, the battles came. One more war, one more campaign, one more alliance broken, one more stone rolled into place for a victory that would not last. Mayapan, in its final days, tried to gather the pieces of the old world. It spoke of unity, of shared rule, of the gods and the calendar and the old ways. But unity is a fragile dream, and dreams, when bent too far, break. A rebellion rose within its walls. It burned. And with it, something ancient fell, not a city, but an idea. That one place, one power, could hold all the others together. The Maya world scattered once again, not in defeat, but in exhaustion. Even as cities fell, the land remained. The forest did not care who ruled. The rivers carried no loyalties. And in the quiet spaces left behind, life went on. The last offensives were not grand. They were quiet. They happened in footpaths and in whispers, not in fanfare. One town raided another over a boundary no one would later remember. A rival lineage claimed a temple no one could keep. Warriors died without songs to name them. Their weapons were not buried with honor, but left beneath leaves and dust. The scribes still carved, but their lines trembled. They were not sure who would read them. They were not sure if anyone still could. The knowledge that had once stretched from valley to coast began to shrink. Each village had its own truths, its own gods, its own history. The Maya world had become not one story, but many. Some still spoke of kings and stars, others told only of hunger, of rain, of the long walk from one place to the next. There was no final day, only a slow fading, a thinning of certainty, a soft forgetting. In the highlands, in places like Kumarkaj and Iximche, new centers tried to rise. The Quiche and Kachiko peoples built cities with stone and belief, holding on to what they could. Their kings were not like those before. They were closer to their people, sometimes chosen not by blood, but by wisdom. Their stories mixed old with new. They remembered the gods, but they also knew fear, of drought, of invasion, of losing what little remained. And yet, they built. They believed. The Popol Vuh, their sacred text, held memories both mythic and real. It was not carved in stone. It was whispered. It was sung. Later, it would be written. But for now, it lived in voice and in breath. In these highland cities, the Maya spirit burned low, but it had not gone out. But even here, war came again. The Spanish arrived, not all at once, but slowly, through trade and word and disease. The Maya met them not as one people, but as many. Some resisted. Others made uneasy peace. There were battles, yes, but there were also long pauses, misunderstandings, desperation. The Maya knew how to fight, but they also knew when to step back, when to wait, when to endure. The Spanish took their cities, but they did not take their silence. In the end, it was not the swords that won. It was time. It was pressure. It was exhaustion. And still, the Maya remained. Not in palaces, but in villages. Not in temples, but in kitchens and markets and hills. Their languages lived on, carried not in books, but in lullabies. Their stories were told by grandmothers, not scribes. The glyphs may have faded, but the breath behind them endured. The final offensives left scars, but they did not erase the soul. The Maya watched their world change, and they adjusted. They planted corn. They raised children. They held funerals. They waited for rain. In the shadows of old pyramids, children played, unaware they were walking across centuries. The kings were gone, but the people remained. They looked to the sky and saw not destiny, but weather. They felt the earth and asked not for prophecy, but for harvest. And in this return to simplicity, they found strength. The resolve had faded. The empire had ended. But the Maya did not. They endured not through victory, but through love. For land, for family, for memory. The battles ended. The silence grew. And in that silence, something eternal held on. The collapse did not arrive like a thunderstorm. It came like a slow rain that never ended, soaking the foundations of a world until they crumbled. Cities once proud and tall grew silent, their stones dark with moss and shadow. The grand plazas, where thousands had gathered to watch kings speak and dancers move, became empty stages for the wind. The temples, carved with stories of gods and kings, stood as monuments to what was lost, but not forgotten. The jungle crept steadily, threading roots through cracks and folding walls into green arms. The people, those who had once filled the streets with laughter and song, had faded into the silence, or moved beyond. The collapse was not a single event. It was a slow unraveling. Each year brought less rain, less food, less hope. The rivers that once flowed strong became thin ribbons, barely enough to sustain the land. The great reservoirs, carefully built and tended, could no longer hold what the sky refused to give. Hunger pressed harder with each passing season. The gods once called upon with fierce devotion seemed distant, silent. The kings lost their voices. The people lost their faith. The collapse was a quiet undoing of everything that had been. In the shadows of the great cities, life struggled on, but it was different. Families gathered in smaller groups, away from the ruins that had once been home. They moved closer to rivers and forests. searching for soil that still bore fruit. The old ways persisted in whispers. The calendars, once carved in stone, were remembered in memory and song. The sacred ceremonies continued, but with fewer hands and less fire. The priests, who once commanded armies, now led only prayers for rain. The people grew tired of promises they could not keep. They learned to live with less. Their children grew up knowing the sound of hunger and the smell of dust instead of feasts and incense. The stories told around fires were tinged with sorrow and hope, memory and loss. The Maya had not vanished, but they had changed. The collapse was not the end of a people, but the end of an age. It marked the breaking of a world built on certainty and the beginning of a new story, written not in stone, but in survival. The consequences of collapse rippled far beyond the cities. Trade routes that once linked distant kingdoms fell silent. Craftsmen who had created delicate jade and painted murals stopped their work. Markets emptied. The exchange of goods and ideas slowed to a trickle. The social structures that had held communities together shifted. Power became local, held by village elders or families rather than kings. The great architectural projects ceased, replaced by simple homes built from wood and clay. The rich tapestry of Maya culture began to fray, though its threads remained in the hearts of those who lived. Disease and warfare added to the suffering, further scattering the people. Some moved south, some moved north. New groups emerged, carrying pieces of the old world into new lands. The collapse was not uniform or total, but it reshaped the continent. It left scars on the land and on memory, and it asked a quiet question that echoed through generations. How do you rebuild when the ground itself has shifted? Yet even as the old world folded, something resilient endured. The Maya spirit, though battered, did not break. Their languages lived on, spoken in forests and villages. Their rituals continued, though changed. Their stories evolved, passed from mouth to mouth, from parent to child. In the highlands, new cities rose, smaller but filled with life and faith. The Popol Vuh, a sacred book, preserved a glimpse of the ancient wisdom and mythology. It told of creation, of gods and heroes, of the dance between light and shadow. It reminded the people who they were, even as the world changed around them. The collapse was a wound, but also a beginning. It was a turning point, a place where sorrow met endurance. The Maya did not disappear. They transformed. They carried their history like a hidden fire, waiting to be rekindled. The collapse marked a moment of silence, yes, but within that silence, the pulse of life continued. A pulse that would beat for centuries to come. Memory is a fragile thread, woven through time with care and sorrow. It carries the weight of those who came before, the echoes of footsteps long gone, the faces of those whose names are lost to stone and story. For the Maya, memory was both a gift and a burden. It was the keeper of history, the guardian of identity, the bridge between the living and the dead. But it was also the price paid for survival. To remember is to feel loss again, to carry the stories of vanished cities, of battles won and lost, of kings who ruled and disappeared, is to carry the weight of absence. The people who survived the collapse held memory close, not as a chain, but as a lantern. It lit their way through darkness, through drought, through silence. They remembered the gods who once spoke in storms and stars, even as those gods seemed to sleep. They remembered the calendars that marked not only time, but fate. They remembered the glyphs carved deep into stone, and though fewer could read them, the shapes lingered like shadows on the mind. The price of memory was high, but without it, the world would be empty. In villages scattered beneath the thick canopy, elders told stories to children beneath flickering fires. These were stories not only of gods and kings, but of the land, of rivers and mountains, of animals and seasons. Each tale was a thread in the great tapestry of identity, connecting generations in quiet continuity. The memory of great cities like Tikal or Palenque was kept alive not in stone, but in voice. Songs carried across fields, weaving old and new. The language itself held memory. Words for rain, for corn, for ancestors. To forget a word was to lose a piece of the past, but remembering also meant mourning. It meant seeing the scars that time had left on the land, and the people. The fields where maize no longer grew as abundantly. The temples that no longer echoed with ceremony. The faces of those who had vanished in war, in hunger, in silence. Memory was a living thing, alive with joy and grief. It was a river that carried both. The price was that the people could never fully rest. The past was never truly past. The memory of loss shaped not only the people, but their land. The jungle, which had once been tamed by stone and sweat, was slowly reclaiming its place. Roots cracked open walls. Trees grew through plazas. Birds nested in places where priests once prayed. The land remembered too, but in a different way. It held the marks of fire and flood, of harvest and famine, of human hands shaping and surrendering. The scars on the earth were invisible to most, but they were there. Reminders that even the strongest civilizations are fragile. The Maya knew this. Their memory was woven into the soil. Their songs spoke of cycles, of birth, death, and rebirth. The price of memory was to live with the past beneath one's feet, to walk carefully, knowing every step was part of a long story. Yet memory also offered hope. The hope that from loss could come new growth, that the stories of old might inspire the dreams of the future, that the people who remained could carry forward the light of what had been, even as the world changed. And so memory lived on, carried in hearts and voices, in language and song, in small acts of remembrance. It was a gift, passed from mother to child, from elder to youth. It was the quiet resistance against forgetting, against the silence that follows loss. The price of memory was heavy, yes. It meant carrying pain and longing. But it also meant belonging. It meant connection. It meant life. The Maya people did not vanish into history. They lived within it. Their stories a bridge between past and present. The memory of a world once bright, with temples and kings, was not a burden to bury. It was a fire to tend. And as long as that fire burned, the Maya spirit endured. Their history was not only a record of what was lost, but a promise of what could be remembered, reclaimed, and reborn. In memory, the past is never truly gone. The fire had passed. The smoke had faded. The cities, once alive with the sound of life and ceremony, had grown silent. Stone temples stood like quiet witnesses beneath the dense canopy, their sharp edges softened by moss and time. The great plazas lay empty, their stories etched into worn steps and faded glyphs. But from the ashes of empire, something else emerged. Not the blaze of conquest, but the slow warmth of endurance. The people who remained carried with them the echoes of what had been. The gods, the kings, the calendars, but also something more delicate. The memory of belonging, of home. What remains after the fire is not only ruin, but roots. It is the breath of those who walk beneath ceiba trees, the whispered prayers of women in small villages, the songs sung softly beneath starry skies. The Maya world did not end with the fall of stone. It continued in the lives of those who loved the land, who tended the earth, who told the stories that could never be carved but only spoken. The jungle embraced the ruins, wrapping them in green silence. Vines curled through doorways where nobles once passed. Birds nested in temple crests where priests once called to the gods. The wild was not an enemy. It was a partner in the long story. It held the past carefully, neither erasing nor glorifying. It simply was. The forests remembered what the people had built, even as they grew beyond it. And the people remembered the forests, their source of life and mystery. They gathered fruits and herbs, hunted with respect, planted maize in clearings made gentle by generations. The relationship between human and nature, once marked by grand projects and power, now found new balance. Life was quieter, smaller, but no less sacred. What remains after the fire is the pulse of earth and sky, the rhythm of rain and sun, the slow turning of seasons that guided daily life. It is a world lived in with humility, with gratitude, with hope. The descendants of the ancient Maya live still. Their voices rise in markets and festivals. Their hands weave cloth, carve wood, and plant seeds. They speak languages that echo the past while living in the present. Their communities carry forward traditions shaped by centuries of change. They face new challenges, new worlds, but within their stories is the unbroken thread of history. The memory of kings and priests lives beside the realities of modern life. The Great Pyramids are no longer thrones of power, but places of reflection. Tourists walk their stones, marveling at the past. But the Maya who call this land home carry the true history in their hearts. They know that what remains after the fire is not only ruin, it is resilience. It is the living pulse of a people who refuse to vanish, who refuse to be forgotten. Their history is not a closed chapter. It is a continuing story, written in language, song, dance, and life. As night falls over the ancient cities, stars emerge one by one. The same stars that once guided Maya priests and kings still watch over the land. Their light is steady, patient, eternal. They remind us that time is not only linear, but cyclical. That endings are also beginnings. That what seems lost may still live in memory, in soil, in breath. The fire may have burned bright and fierce, but it did not consume all. From the ashes, roots took hold. From silence, stories grew. From loss, hope blossomed. The Maya civilization, with all its beauty and pain, lives on, not only in history books or museum walls, but in the quiet strength of those who carry its legacy forward. What remains after the fire is not only the past, it is the promise of tomorrow, the heartbeat of a people, steady and sure, beneath the vast sky. The end.